Hello, this is James and welcome back. This episode will mark my 10th commentary and the second episode of the Other Games subseries. Less so for this video since the only other games I'll discuss at length will be other Mario Karts, although I do have quite a few cursory name drops to make since many series of games have been on my mind seeing as I've been looking for something to play this summer. I'm very glad that I've been able to reach the double-digit milestone considering how tenuous the idea for the series was when I first had it. This video's topic has a bit to do with why I started the series while simultaneously managing to be something I wanted not to have to cover for as long as possible. I touched upon my motivations momentarily in episode 1, but around the middle of last year I started to notice that my MKW career was going nowhere fast. I had next to no clans or as much passion for the game as I formerly had, all while managing to get more and more people on my bad side through a combination of bad social RNG and aimless toxicity on my part. So I told myself that I was just going to act upon my long-held series idea once and for all, and if it wasn't well received, I'd just continue it until I'd exhausted my thoughts and be able to quit unreservedly. And although it would have hurt to put the game down knowing I never got to get my thoughts out there, another one of the reasons I felt particularly chronologically compelled to begin the series somewhat prematurely is because I suddenly realized that the possibility of a new installment in the Mario Kart series releasing and siphoning all of the activity away was a strong possibility for 2025, and my concerns were proven right with the announcement of Mario Kart World. Now that MK9 is out, there's a poignant sense of posthumousness that will pervade all of my future commentaries going forwards, which is a milieu I'm grateful I got to not exist within while producing all the episodes I've uploaded thus far, but one which will nevertheless inescapably mark this episode and every forthcoming entry in the eyes of the vast majority of observers as the ravings of some insane belligerent schizo who inexplicably stays behind to die in the flood while everyone else boards the Ark of Culture and sails away. It's notably different with 8D because it's been out for long enough that eschewing it is now seen as a legitimate approach, but deliberately foregoing MK9, that is to say, not playing it or concerning myself with it even for the sake of hating it, is going to be damn annoying to deal with for a while during the collective Nintendo consumer base's honeymoon phase with it. This seems to be a ubiquitous phenomenon for any group of people who attempt to take sanctuary in a series' older entries. In the past, whenever I thought I'd found a group of people who were sufficiently self-immunized against consumerist released hype cycles for their given series, I'd find that they would, inevitably, tragically fawn over whatever forthcoming entry promised to save the series from its previously irrevocably unrecoverable but now totally making a comeback status. But I want to be clear as to what it is I'm strictly referring to. In the wake of a new entry in a series, your decision to continue to play any previous entries is contextualized fundamentally differently than it was before that release, and the one before it, and so on. The decision to renounce a bad new entry in a series is one that can result in a lot of psychological strain, not just for the fans on an individual level, but also for the series as a whole. Sometimes it can be easy, anyone can tell you that Resident Evil 2 and 4 are superior to each of the future releases, but what about trying to explain that you preferred the original Resident Evil 4 to the remake? I imagine it would feel distinctly melancholic to watch as other fans of a series, including your friends in that series' community, continue to move forwards in tune with each new release while you denounce each further title, especially in instances where those new releases are so collectively well received. However, as the gaming industry has continued to collapse in on itself, such a thing has become less of a concern. I feel that a perverse kind of silver lining has emerged wherein fan bases have resigned themselves to accepting adequacy in lieu of excellence. Plenty of people whose opinions are certainly worth respecting consider Black Ops 6 a perfectly serviceable experience, but it's equally as likely that you won't find it worth playing over the older CODs. Even at its best, Call of Duty has fallen victim to the same kind of substantial depreciation in quality that many game series have over the course of the back half of the 2010s and now the 2020s. But how much nicer and how much easier on the mind would it be to simply have the fortuitous opportunity to actively experience a game series during the height of its success and quality? outside of people like me who prefer older games who I have no reason to believe exist in any corporation revenue threatening capacity at all, because I've never met any other so-called retro gamers who ascribe any intrinsic sense of superiority to their favorite titles to the extent that they actively forego new releases and require them to overwhelmingly prove themselves to even be offered a chance. It seems to be a me thing exclusively. Such people may still exist, but there's especially little reason to believe they do in the broader context of online multiplayer as a whole. Within every community I've encountered that centers around an older release, the act of continuing to play a technically obsoleted game is not something that any of these people do out of a true underlying volition, but rather out of necessity. If you were seeking an active online competitive Mario Kart experience but couldn't stomach the intentionally infantilized nature of 8D, or I suppose 2 or 7, then MKW would have been your only choice from the time frame in between when 8D's release killed 8U up until this week. But when push comes to shove, very few people won't jump ship immediately, even if it's just to give a perfunctory assessment of the new entry in question. It's easy to take a cynical view on this phenomenon, and I certainly do in just about every instance, but I feel less of a sense of callousness regarding MK World's release, given how much it's already been tarnished by circumstances surrounding the MSRP of it and the Switch 2, as well as the concerning nature of the Grand Prix mode's gimmicky interconnected world, the forcible accommodation of 24-player races via long straightaways and meandering track design. You get the point. People will ultimately have either made the transition to MK9 or returned to MKW in a few months' time, but as far as this treatise of mine is concerned, I will of course take the role of contentious critic in this video, just the same methodology I've always maintained when pertaining to modern games, because I don't believe that the approach that Nintendo has taken to 8D, and seemingly MK9, is capable of producing anything that even remotely rivals MKW. I'm going to delve into a category of thought that I tried to ascribe a better moniker to, but which I'm forced to refer to out of a lack of superior alternatives as the development circumstances of a game. What I'm trying to get at with the term involves multiple related concepts. Developer attitudes towards what they desire to make and what they're actually making, how well they're able to realize that vision, or possibly visions if the team fails to manifest a single united one, the cultural attitudes towards the series the game belongs to or the genre the game belongs to, as well as intrinsic circumstances like the power of the hardware the game is running on, the design of the controllers used to play the game, such as the collective disdain towards the N64 controller, or the internet capacity of a given console. Everything within the comprehensive milieu of a game's development from a deterministic perspective falls under this loosely articulated banner. I'm once again back on my usual horse of trying to paint some interpretive sort of history through the lens of deterministic underlying circumstances surrounding games, because in taking this approach to the Mario Kart series, I've found my appreciation for MKW has redoubled across the board. No matter which avenue of this development circumstances idea I interpret the game through, whether that be what developer decisions were made deliberately versus what exists because of oversight, or what was left out as a result of hardware limitations and the presumed rush that the devs had to go through to get the game out in time for the summer release of 2008, or even in the context of the late 2000s themselves and the inchoate sphere of online multiplayer gaming, every conclusion I come to points to MKW's monumentality, and contrarily, the very same approach is where angles of criticism for the Mario Kart series' other games can be found as well. Any claim someone makes as to what game in the series is the best is also an a priori value judgment as to the other games in the series. If you state that Melee is the best Smash game, the value judgment in question is that Ultimate and Brawl failed to meet its caliber, either by failing to do what Melee did but better, or failing to surpass Melee through those games' new characters and mechanics. As far as Mario Kart goes, the failure of 8D's implicit attempt to surpass MKW is a result of both. Not only do the game mechanics that were not present in MKW disappoint in 8D, but when directly compared to MKW in categories like shortcuts and mechanical design, it fails as well. I'll make an argument for MKW's superiority via its development circumstances in two parts. The first having to do with deliberate design choices taken during the game's development, and the second involving the intrinsic and even irreproducible circumstances that begot many of the greatest aspects of the game. Since I'm talking about the Mario Kart series as a whole, it only makes sense that I contextualize the release period of MKW itself with the preceding entry in the series, which was MKDS. In this regard, Wii is a fascinating case study of Nintendo's attempt to define the game distinctly differently from MKDS by changing, and or fixing, depending on who you ask, the way that mini turbos worked and the item balance such that front-running would not be entirely overpowered. I get the impression from the art style and menu GUI that Wii was supposed to be to the series what 8U was, something that affected a sense of professionalism in a series that had meandered presentation style-wise over the course of the preceding entries. Perhaps the most telling signifier of this is simply the way the 3-2-1 countdown text appears on screen. I recall hearing a critic state that the equivalent countdown text from Double Dashes proved that its presentation was superior to MKW's because it maintained its pervasive cartoonishness even through those small intricate motifs, whereas we didn't seem to care for how it came off stylistically. But even if such a thing does represent a kind of unfinishedness, it still points to how MKW takes itself seriously. You drive the racetrack and Funky Kong does all kinds of cheering and yelling, but it's not to make you laugh. The game is merely taking its universe entirely at face value. To transpose that concept then, that sense of seriousness the developers are trying to impress upon you, that MKW is a legitimate racing game which respects you as a player, is also made evident via a concept that I've heard referred to in game discussion as an emergent system, which is the most critical and fundamental basis behind a lot of MKW's design, and it's contributed to by both the physics engine as well as facets of the in-race UI. To put it simply, an emergent system is what arises in a game when simple concepts compound atop each other to create a greater and more immersive experience that may or may not have, keep that in mind, been intended by the developers. I could waste my time explaining why something like the Y2K immersive sim Deus Ex is so brilliant in this regard, but that has nothing to do with MKW. I would be much better off once again invoking MKW's tertiary competitive sister game Melee. Of course, fighting games are not exactly structurally simple given the sheer number of moves you have at your disposal at any given juncture in a match, but the factors that make Melee special are unique to it alone. Developer oversights like wave shining and unpatched move hitboxes create a milieu that can't exist elsewhere. The rise of the skill ceiling over multiple decades of Melee's existence is a result of the community continuing to dig ever deeper and redefine a game that has, at times, previously seemed solved. And it's because of how its mechanics reciprocally complement each other to create something incomprehensibly more competitive than was intended. And it's exactly through the beauty of its emergentness that the game is played at the level that it's at today. In MKW, the overarching factor that facilitates emergence is the track design. I'll circle back to this in the second section because it also applies there, but even irrespective of hardware or developer limitations, the greatness of MKW is seamlessly baked into the RT designs. The precisely calculated distance of something like the gap jump on MG and how it visually presents itself when exiting the cave is such that it naturally invites the inquisitive player to take a shot at it, which I imagine has begun a process that thousands of people have individually undergone. An unaware yet curious beginner wonders to themselves if the distance can be cleared with a shroom and a hop, followed by some initial promise and finally a successful attempt. That sense of accomplishment and discovery that this hypothetical newcomer would feel upon landing the gap jump is a microcosm of how MKW makes people feel on a larger scale. That experimentation and exploration will be rewarded as part of the game's masterfully crafted system of emergent player response. What's most interesting to me regarding the gap jump is that there's no real definitive answer as to whether or not it was originally intended by the developers. It was intentional in the 8D port, of course, but given how awful all of the MKW devs were at driving the tracks, as evidenced by the Nintendo expert ghosts, the ability to clear the gap may have only been a fortunate coincidence. Most crucial to note here, though, is that irrespective of whether it was intended or not, the freedom to try the cut for yourself unobstructed is present. There is no out-of-bounds plane. Lakitu doesn't pick you up and forcefully drag you away every time you attempt something unconventional like an MK8. Building upon this concept, an even more intriguing instance exists with the GV Rock Hop. There's a great deal going on here. When taken in totality, it almost seems to indicate a tacit sort of unspoken proposition from MKW's devs to its players. Here's this rock with drivable KCO in the middle of a pool of lava that connects two sections of the track. It's positioned perfectly elevation-wise and bridges the gap remarkably conveniently, practically beckoning you to shroom onto it. More than any other instance of a cut in the base game, I'd consider the Rock Hop to be the most compelling piece of evidence that Nintendo intended for MKW to specifically be emergent. Whereas with MG, it's reasonable to assume that nobody at Nintendo HQ or any of the playtesters could have made the gap jump, given that it would have required a fast vehicle and a well-timed shroom plus hop input. Rock Hop can be made by doing nothing more than pointing yourself towards it. Even someone being handed the controller for the first time can carefully align themselves and just shroom straight forward. I honestly find it completely unbelievable that not a single person would have been aware of this, and yet there it remains regardless. Additionally, to state that the piece of terrain that facilitates the Rock Hop would have been removed from the game if the cut were to have been found to be possible during development would be anachronistic and fallacious, because it directly insinuates that the development philosophy behind MK8, wherein improvisation was very heavily de-emphasized and actively made far more difficult, was the same one that underscored MKW. But MKW is genius precisely because of this ambiguity. There are no holographic mushroom indicators, no glowing arrows pointing to the gap jump, or even the golden strat on CM, which I didn't know about as a kid. The developers aren't nudging you any which way. The tracks are merely presented as is, and players can go ham at their own discretion. I'm not a fan of open world games because I believe they're intended to provide the most boring experience per capita of minutes played, but the fundamental principles of a good open world game and MKW's most interesting shortcuts are identical, and it's once again about that sense of emergence, design that leaves players feeling as if they've carved out their own route in a world that makes that possible. MK8's developers, on the other hand, presumably saw MKW players using the game as their personal freestyle ground and were horrified. Of course, that is, strictly speaking, only speculative, but I don't feel that it's far-fetched, and it's certainly not without precedent. Masahiro Sakurai, the director of both Smash Melee and Ultimate, states that he has mixed feelings about Melee because he believes that its unintentionally emergent mechanics and subsequent deep complexities serve to drive away newcomers and casuals who obviously have been a critical demographic of Nintendo's ever since the Wii success. With that mentality being expressed by one of Nintendo's most tenured directors, it's easy to imagine a world where MK8's developers were unambiguously told to rein in MKW's exploration-conducive design. You may disagree with me that Nintendo took an unintrusive approach to patching cuts in MKW, and that the game's serendipitous brokenness is a result of nothing more than limitations and oversights, which I'll address in the next part, but whether you do or not, it is undeniable that Nintendo both had the resources to create a game in which you were forced to stay on the patronizingly short leash that their modern games usually keep you on. Keep in mind they feel they have to uphold some kind of image in this regard, as well as the desire to uncompromisingly do so. Mario Kart 8's design with this in mind exists entirely along this line. The shortcuts in the game are entirely predefined, whether they're encountered in the form of the universally present, laughably small grass cuts, or even more controlled, such as the undoubtedly focus group approved shroom spot on Sweet Sweet Canyon featuring an oversized donut hole on the off-road with an arrow pointing to it on the last turn. I don't know what it is about that cut in particular, but it's always stuck out in my mind as being tragically emblematic of the worst tendencies of the MK8 design team in their attempt to steer clear of the non-linearity of MKW's cuts. I could go on forever, but this specific argument should be clear enough already, and I don't have an hour and a half like last video, so let me say this. I think Mario Kart 8 for the Wii U is a perfectly serviceable game, and is a worthy flagship console Mario Kart successor to MKW. I hate Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and I think that the underlying game engine behind 8U, as well as the majority of 8U's competitive motifs, for lack of a better word, produced the best possible interpretation of a so-called modern Mario Kart. It's extremely easy to forget, and I would not blame anyone who has, that 8U is fundamentally incomparable to 8D. Something I considered early on into the process of notating my thoughts for this video while mulling the 8U, 8D distinction over is that 8D did such a jaw-droppingly atrocious job at importing the mechanics and systems from 8U that the 8D experience is foundationally transmogrified because of it. Now, because I try to subject most of my thoughts to a sort of second filter pass to ensure that I'm not pounding sand over shit that everyone already knows, I immediately saw that this idea wouldn't take hardly any justification on my part because it's entirely self-evident upon direct comparison, but upon further inspection, it's actually astounding how little was really changed from the base that is 8U, or at least prior to Wave 1. After all, the game is at first glance nothing more than a re-release that shares a majority of the track and character and vehicle roster. The corollary realization that I then made is that 8U works so well precisely because the holistic sum total of its systems was so carefully defined, ironically in a way that made it so susceptible to the maximal damage done by the tweaks made in 8D and its DLC balance patches. Whereas MKW is a game in which you walk a thin line between aggression and defensiveness, 8U promotes defensive gameplay through and through. The game is such a war of attrition, and it's definitely not for the faint of heart. There are so many factors that can insta-kill your race. You have to keep track of other players' items via item spy or watching for what's in their hand while simultaneously looking out for stars and bills on the minimap. You also have to do this while considering whether it's worth it to get coins at a given juncture in the race and worrying about reds, which are extremely overpowered and put you in an even deeper coin deficit, despite the fact you only have one item slot and trailing doesn't let you get another item, all while demon sliding to gain a marginal driving advantage over opponents. Compared to MKW, where so many of the best players winning races involve either holding A or holding a star, there's so much more immediate consideration that must be ceaselessly undergone in 8U. I propose that the modification of just a single one of these mechanics or subsystems would invariably disrupt the way the entire game plays to a catastrophic level. And so naturally that is exactly what Nintendo did in the intermission between 8U and 8D. It's actually astonishing how 8D utterly eviscerated every last iota of the allure found through the careful choreography of 8U's interwoven mechanics via changes to the game's code that can't have taken more than a few weeks. Through the addition of double items, coins cease to be a nuanced mechanic and become a breathless botherance to keep track of in the wake of the never-ending item spam of reds and smart bouncing greens while people try to desperately farm for shrooms every set. Through the removal of demon sliding, something that had previously made the driving feel like a spiritual successor to MKW's latent skill-based mechanics, straightaways became a bore. Through the addition of the boo, item spamming is redoubly encouraged because any attempts to item smuggle can die on a dime. Nintendo doesn't want to fix the broken netcode, but they do fix, at least in their eyes, think back to earlier, they want their games like this, the inherently difficult parts of DLC tracks in their 8D iterations like CM and Moonview, alongside other things, many other things. MKW, as it is played today, is a holdover that belongs to an incredibly small subset of multiplayer video games. For just about as long as online multiplayer has existed, the ability for developers to patch those games via online updates has existed alongside it. But when it comes to the slimmest margin of online experiences of the 2000s, there exists just a tiny handful for which an online patch was either infeasible or would have incurred more effort than it would have been worth, and so attain a status that it is structurally impossible for any online game released in the 2010s or later to equal. This irreproducible and essentially unique to MKW status is the one and only reason why the game exists at the capacity it does today. If not for this condition of practical unpatchability, glitches and ultras as we know them would not exist. They would have been fixed either initially, if you believe that Nintendo has always had the same development mentality they had leading up to 8U, or at some point later on in the WFC era. I can say this with confidence because Nintendo has made it crystal clear how they wish for people to both play and perceive their games. They have an extremely lucrative financial incentive to present an image of Nintendo games to the public as streamlined and glitch-free, because that's what distinguishes Nintendo from their competition. It's the Mario magic, or whatever you want to call it. I just got done explaining how 8D and even 8U were constructed through this methodology, but with the release of 8D's DLC, Nintendo did something that even some of the game's most zealous players thought was too far. They overhauled the systems that fundamentally underscored the game, again. If 8U and pre-DLC 8D can be thought of as MK8 versions 1 and 2, 8D's DLC waves comprised MK8 version 3. Beginning in Wave 3 of the DLC, Nintendo made it clear they had zero qualms reversing the way entire mechanics worked by giving you invincibility during gliders, whereas you could previously be TS'd on them, essentially turning gliders into cannons, and they also begun their spontaneous campaign of adjusting iframes as a unique character and vehicle stat. But it was nothing compared to how haphazardly they'd adjust the meta in Waves 4 through 6. Wave 4 was, for many Nintendo fanboys on the younger side, the first time they'd ever witnessed one of their favorite entertainment properties be so carelessly handled. I personally wish them a warm welcome to the club, and the TT community didn't really take it so well, though I'm not exactly sure how they could have. The infamous Waluigi Wiggler setup was notably nerfed, and in its place rose an eclectic arrangement of previously completely unviable setups, to the ultimate effect of chronologically dividing the 8D time trial scene into pre- and post-Wave 4. A few months later, they did it again. All of it just to a lesser degree. More stat changes, more iframe changes, the meta turned on its head once more. And finally, in Wave 6, a decisive meta change was made to the game that, more than any other I've made mention of, establishes now and forever exactly what Nintendo thinks of you, the consumer, and the laughably bizarre response that is incurred by their customers being seen experiencing their products in an even remotely unconventional manner. I'm of course referring to the so-called removal of bagging. In short, stopping at an item set would guarantee you top spot items regardless of your position, meaning that whatever seed you may find yourself in at a given point of the race is essentially locked in, barring any sort of slapstick maneuver, run into a wall while not nearby an item set, trying to trick the game into thinking you're losing spots legitimately, or what have you. Being rigidly funneled into mindlessly holding A by an entirely imposed ex post facto patch from an arbitrary DLC balance update is more poetic than anything I could have possibly ever come up with. It's so silly that I can only even bring myself to harp on about this for a little while, as opposed to the scathing critique that I initially had in mind. Game Design 101. In any scenario in which a player feels like they have options, go preposterously far out of the way to ensure that they're undertaking the avenue of gameplay that involves the least amount of thought at all times. I'm sure Valve wrote something to that effect on all the blackboards at their development studio while conceptualizing the Portal series. Such a genius approach must be why those games are still discussed today, right? Funny as fuck by me, as always. But remember how I said that Nintendo has the resources to make you play by their rules? I introduced this section by remarking that MKW is part of a forgotten tradition for a good reason. Even amongst its late 2000s peers, MKW still stands out for its lack of online patches. Its 7th console generation counterparts, the Xbox 360 and PS3, had no problem implementing them. Evidently, though, the Wii posed much more of an obstacle to patching because the console developers were inconsiderate that it would incidentally be vital in ensuring stability. If you're aware of the game Skyward Sword from the Zelda series, an entire Wii channel for the sake of patching just that game alone had to be pushed through via the Wii Shop channel to fix a softlock glitch. The fact that there was no guarantee that those who needed the patch would be able to receive it is fascinating given how narrow the time span was, in an overarching sense that consoles were both internet capable and yet not always necessarily capable of receiving patches. Such a phenomenon is then, in hindsight, an exclusive phenomenon of the 6th and 7th generation of consoles, seeing as the inability to force a patch would cease to exist entirely from mainstream gaming as of the 8th generation. Or, to put that in other terms, for the remainder of the collective lifespan of video games as a medium, there will never again be another new release that is incapable of receiving updates. There's even an entire industry built around gentrifying games that were incomplete on release, like No Man's Sky, but invoking that milieu would be to get ahead of myself, because this is all still couched within Nintendo's approach to competitive games. And with respect to MKW, its unique state of unpatchedness is the one and only reason why any of the coveted and iconic set pieces that define this game are still a part of it. Reconsidering the game from the perspective of track structure, but this time with a focus on things that only exist by virtue of limitation, is how it becomes apparent that MKW is an experience of developer conceptualized design in equal part with the completely coincidental byproducts of the incredible ways that its physics engine adaptively reflects this perfect intersection of limitation and oversight. BC3 has always fascinated me from a game design standpoint, in that the absence of an out-of-balance plane on the cut section seemed so perplexing as a child. I could never wrap my head around how nobody thought to ensure that people weren't skipping a huge turn, even if the physics behind it may not have been recognized by any of the playtesters. I spoke of a similar condition when I mentioned GV earlier, but the key difference here is that the cut could have only been removed by the addition of something rather than the removal of a thing. On the one hand, this is where things get fuzzy. Perhaps Nintendo's devotion to professionalism prevented them from inserting something so arbitrary as an out-of-bounds plane there. It would certainly feel strange to suddenly get counted out and watch your screen fade to black while still mid-air. MK8 sort of diegetically rectified this by having Lakitu be much more proactive by flying right into you and discarding the screen fade into black so that having your hand forcibly held for you would look less jarring from an in-universe perspective. But on the other hand, there's also an angle that makes sense when interpreted with the Wii's hardware in mind. Perhaps the developers wanted to keep as little unnecessary collision data on each track as possible to ensure that there would be minimal overhead to prevent lag. BC3 is obviously nowhere close to lagging, but if we hypothesize that collision data reduction was an operating principle amongst MKW's developers, then given this, there exists a glitch for which the associated oversight makes perfect sense. BC Wii is the RT that is the closest to lagging at any given time out of all of the base game designs, because it's quite complex and contains a large amount of track data. Thereby, distributing the KCL economically would have likely been a design goal of the programmers, given that any excess collision data would put the track at risk of dropping frames in scenarios that put additional stress on the processor, like when a lot of items and players have to be rendered. And it is only as a result of the lack of ostensibly redundant KCL that the BC Wii glitch is possible at all. Without the lack of collision on the walls that you phase through while taking it, there would be no such thing. Likewise, the same procedure can be taken in interpreting the other glitches and physics engine nuances. As much as I'd love to hyper-scrutinize the MKW to try to parse the resultant effect of hardware limitations, there's not very deep I can go into an individual facet of its impact. Discussion on my part would end up being a mile wide and an inch deep because I'm not a game designer. For instance, I could mention how diegetically the idea of MKW being a worldwide game with its visual imagery of globes and country lines works perfectly with the limited amount of internet bandwidth that is used by the game, thereby allowing people who don't have good enough connections for other competitive games to be able to compete. But I think I can aspire to a bit more originality in my commentary here. What I just got at in the preceding section is an aspect of a much broader and considerably under-discussed topic I've recently been thinking about. The concept of limitations engendering games that are actually superior to those that would have been produced if the developers were capable of unimpededly realizing their vision is at the core of the most intelligent discipline of video game criticism that I've seen recently, and it's such a vindication of all of the thoughts and feelings I incurred while growing up that I was never capable of satisfyingly articulating. I'm old enough to have experienced the peak of multiplayer gaming as it existed in many games that happened to maintain, as a byproduct of mere fortuitous chronological circumstance, the perfect equilibrium between graphical fidelity, art style, and high-minded sensibilities toward gameplay. It's easy to interpret the boundlessly broad, ongoing downfall of gaming from a cultural lens exclusively. The kind of overambitious, detailed foliage simulators with ham-fisted postmodernist stories are not the wrong place to start, but their easy-to-criticize nature can often result in critics of modern games getting stuck in a feedback loop that leads them farther and farther off of the objectivist analyses that they should be striving for. In honor of trying to reach the most true-to-life conclusions that reflect legitimate, entrenched issues within gaming as opposed to subjective, surface-level interpretations, I've taken to upping the pay grade when it comes to my disdain for modern games, namely trying to strike as deep as possible at the heart of a thing that I dislike while really only delivering an introductory analysis on my part. And with that in mind, I'll deliver some preliminary thoughts on MK World from my brief observations of it so as to bookend this within the overarching topic since it's obviously on everybody's mind at the moment. I'm very quick to write off new entries in a series for perceived game-wide failings like a poor art style and whether or not some of the difficult-to-express aspects are carried over. As far as games where vehicle locomotion is a focus go, I've heard one cornerstone referred to as the physicality of the movement, which I'll use here. While watching Cole's semi-public pre-release stream, I felt an overwhelming sense that the physicality of the carts had been utterly compromised on, and that the vehicles felt so sluggish and artificial that I was ready to write the entire game off on that basis alone, but it seems to me that now, a few days out, the world record cart combinations only impress some of that initial feeling onto me. I get the impression that the physics engine was either initially sprung from some Frankensteinian port of the MK Tour engine or was a concerted effort to recreate how the vehicles handle in that game. Just the sort of boost, blowback, and suspension of the cars gives me that impression, and for what it's worth, that is a terrible impression to give off. I still don't find it as easy to hate as I did upon my very first viewing, but there's an all-pervasive sense of trite artifice with regards to the sound design and OST floaty physics whenever you're not on a rail, and is evidently just watered down in every aspect, like trick timing being irrespective of how long it's been since you left the trickable surface, as well as in abstaining from any hallmarks of track design that could cause offense, like the smoothed out topography on desert hills, just to name one. Charging MTs is probably the most demonstrative of the general sense of mechanical gaudiness and the lack of attention paid to tactility. You can practically charge one in a straight line as far as I'm seeing if you just delay drift it. It seems cheap in my opinion, which is further compounded by the unimpressive UI, world map design, everything else. The experience is generally unconvincing as a simulacrum of a real race by any means, but I'd like to wrap this video up by dedicating a moment to pondering the ubiquitousness of rails and their broader teleology, since I can't comment upon what 24-player competitive is like yet. Firstly, it's of course deeply ironic that the so-called open-world game features the most linear Temple Run-esque gameplay on an immediate basis, but it's also intriguing because despite the laughable linearity and infantilization of the mechanic itself, it's been used in some half-interesting ways to create shortcuts that wouldn't otherwise exist. I perceive it almost like Nintendo's answer to the lack of shortcut depth in MK8, despite the unmistakable fact that it's quite literally on rails, i.e. the entirety of Airship Fortress. The rails function as a method of simulating the autonomousness of MKW without actually freeing the player, which is a great allegory for what I've seen throughout MK9. The track designs are a simulacrum of emergence. The visual effects and trick patterns are intended to induce an effortless dopamine release, like with being able to spam tricks on a straight rail, or the generally overstimulating nature of 24-player double-item mid-pack spam-fest clusterfucks. There's more that I could say, but it would ultimately be redundant. In a word, the game simply feels fake. However, before I get done, I wanted to respond to a video, it'll be linked below of course, that I was recommended just yesterday from a disillusioned MK World player, and I thought to myself while watching that I could easily reconcile it with the preceding sections of this commentary. If there's one thing that I can't stand in the field of video game criticism, it's the kind of person whose analysis is entirely at face value. However, as surface level and unrefined as this is, it can be insightful as to the reviewer as well as the wider consumer base who also don't think rigorously. I'm shocked at how someone can claim, at least implicitly, to have decisively struck down a game only for all of their complaints to revolve around week 1 launch hiccups. You really think that Nintendo's never going to buff the rail speeds, or that the overrepresentation of intermission courses on Wi-Fi won't be fixed? Apart from rectifiable systems, which I'm sure the devs will focus on in the coming months, it doesn't seem as if this guy has any foundational grievances at all. As far as I can tell, it would be 24 players of fun for the whole family if he could make a few cursory alterations. In lieu of any further thought on MK9 itself, I'll end off with this response. MK9 is, in practicality, a platform, one that is defined by its potential. Will it be improved by the inevitable waves of patches and DLC, or will it decline in competitive cohesion from the base product? The game at any given time is entirely indeterminate. You may have made a purchase of the game with a discrete product in mind, but it will remain in flux for years. When the day does come where a stable iteration is finally set in stone, MK10 will be just over the horizon to supersede it. And just as MKW exists structurally diametrically to 8D and 9 because it is not updated, so too is the act of continuing to play it as new entries continue to overhaul the Mario Kart series. Bit of an abrupt ending, but I've been too melodramatic with them recently, so I'll keep it unceremonious like I should be. I've certainly said my piece on what I had in store for today, so thank you for watching.